Before I tell you how I got fired for refusing to apologize to the girlfriend of a 27-year-old man, comment where you are watching from. I am always curious how far my story travels and who is sitting on the other side of the screen listening to something that should never have happened in the first place. I worked at Horizon Trails, a high-end senior care center on the western edge of Colorado, where every morning smelled faintly of disinfectant. Metal carts clattered against each other, and the old yellow hallway lights reflected off floors so clean you could see every wrinkle on your face. It was not glamorous, but in that place, each breath, each pill, each on-time step could decide the safety of more than 100 elderly residents. My name is Evelyn Hart, 48 years old. My title was long but painfully clear: Director of Resident Safety and Operational Compliance. In this industry, that means standing right between America's three hardest forces: federal regulations, aging patients, and impatient 20-somethings. I have done this job for 17 years, long enough to know which alarm is about to go off before it actually does. Residents called me something I never took offense to: the girl who keeps the world running on time. I did not laugh when they said it, but I never denied it either. They were right. The first person I usually saw every morning was Mrs. June, 84 years old, with mild dementia, gentle like early autumn sunlight. She asked me the same question every single day: "Honey, is it time for my medicine yet?" And I always answered the same way: "Yes, ma'am, you are all set." Eventually, I realized she wasn't asking to check the schedule. She was asking to be sure someone still remembered her. In this line of work, you learn a truth most people never understand. Most residents do not need medicine as much as they need certainty. That is why I have no patience for carelessness, especially from people who think they are good at their job without any evidence to back it up. Enter Zach Doyle. He was a senior experience enhancement specialist, a title that sounded like someone tried to make intern look expensive. Zach had the kind of confidence that came from filming more videos than reading policy manuals. Whenever I asked if he had reviewed the new CMS guidelines, he shrugged and said he got the general vibe. In elderly care, a vibe does not save anyone. The near miss happened on a cold morning when the weather was turning and gray clouds rolled over the north wing. I walked into Hall C and saw that June had not received her medication on time. I opened the EMR system and froze. Her med schedule had been shifted 40 minutes later than the federally mandated window. A tiny change, but enough to violate CMS F tag 755, enough to cause a blood pressure crash or a severe confusion episode. I did not yell. I did not panic. I did what I always do. Well, work, call the on-call physician. Document the incident. Submit the near miss. Correct the chart. I moved so fast that the person beside me did not realize anything had happened. Then I checked the system log, and there it was, edited by Zach Doyle, and as usual, he had no idea how dangerous that tiny adjustment could have been. I was finishing the report when I heard a chirpy voice coming from the community room. Ava Benton, Zach's girlfriend, was live streaming, voice sweet as honey, sharp as freshly polished acrylic nails. Ava was a wellness influencer who sold vitamins online, always carrying a tiny camera and a smile bigger than the front door. She told thousands of viewers that I had an attitude, that I wasn't friendly to younger staff, that I made the center toxic. I had spoken to her maybe 3 times in my life, but now truth loses every time to someone's feelings on camera. I kept working. Ava did not. She pulled Zach into the frame and asked him if he had ever seen me smile. He said no. They both laughed, like that alone proved I was some kind of danger. I thought it would fade like every other meaningless live stream she made, until my CEO sent a building-wide alert: mandatory all-center meeting. I was surprised, but not worried. Most meetings in this field mean nothing. This one did not. 60 staff gathered. The CEO stood in the center, looking like he was about to announce something more serious than an economic collapse. Behind him, the screen replayed Ava's live stream, posted barely 2 hours earlier. Then he turned to me and said in front of everyone, "Evelyn will be suspended until she apologizes to Ava." He said it slow and steady, like he believed he was doing the right thing. I looked at him. I looked at Zach, trying not to smile. I looked at Ava, wrapped in a soft pink sweater if she had won something. I did not make a speech. I did not argue. I only said two words. I understand. Not loud, not bitter, not shaken, just calm, like still water in a glass. But anyone standing close enough could see what he could not. My silence was not surrender. It was the sound of a trigger pulling back on a weapon he did not know he had just loaded. And that is when the real fight began, the moment I walked out of that room. I walked out of the meeting room with a strange feeling, not anger. Anger flares up fast and dies just as quickly. What I felt was more like a cold wind sliding through a long hallway, warning that winter was coming, even though the sky was still blue. Anyone who has worked in elder care long enough knows that feeling. The quiet before the storm. No one screams, no one runs, but everything around you starts shifting in ways outsiders never notice. I went back to my office and opened the wooden door with the cracked edge the center never bothered to replace for 3 years. My desk had nothing personal on it, just four folders, a notebook, and a silver clip pen slightly faded from the day Mrs. June gave it to me on my birthday last year. People say I live minimally, but the truth is I live by a rule. Anything that can become evidence should never be excessive. I sat down and opened the old notebook. The pages were yellowing at the corners, my handwriting still neat as always. I recorded the meeting, the CEO's demands, and Ava and Zach's words. Not to complain, to document. 17 years of compliance work taught me one thing. Human memory bends with emotion, but ink never lies. When I closed the notebook, everything around me stirred old memories, like an old wound warming up when the weather shifts. In 2015, Horizon Trails nearly faced a $150,000 penalty for medication inspection errors. A new staff member forgot to log the evening dose for 4 residents. One missing line, but to the federal system, that was a serious violation. The CEO at the time was devastated, and the head of nursing could barely sit still. I spent 36 straight hours reviewing every note, cross-checking every EMR entry, finding a typo in the medication lot number, then rewriting the CMS appeal to bring the penalty down to 0. No one mentioned my contribution afterwards, but everyone breathed easier. So did I. In 2019, we faced a severe staffing shortage. A flu wave knocked out 30% of our employees. Horizon Trails was on the verge of halting new admissions. I rebuilt the entire staffing schedule by hand based on each person's capacity, making sure no one exceeded their legal hours while keeping our elderly residents safe. I worked double shifts, slept on the break room bench, lived on instant noodles for 3 days, and got the center through its hardest week since the day I started. I am not telling these stories to brag. People like me have nothing to brag about except calm hands and the ability to see a problem before it breaks. But when you spend years inside a system that leans on you, you learn to recognize the moment it starts leaning on the wrong person. Zach was the clearest example. He walked like the floor was obligated to make way for the gel in his hair. He talked like reading half a management book gave him the authority to rewrite healthcare regulations. I do not know who gave him the power to adjust medication schedules, but I knew exactly who had to fix the mess every time he optimized. That person was always me. I did not hate Zach. To hate someone, you have to give them more emotion than indifference. But I saw the danger early. People like Zach do not cause disasters out of malice, but out of ignorance. And ignorance is the greatest enemy in elder care. Ava was a different kind of problem. She did not break systems. She broke people's emotional stability. She said I made her feel unsafe emotionally. I do not know what emotional danger means when the person saying it live streams 4 hours a day and cries on camera whenever things do not go her way. Still, I wrote down every statement she made, every video she posted, not to intimidate her, to protect myself in a world where truth loses to someone's hurt feelings. The CEO was the type I had seen too many times, someone who earned a leadership title not because he could make the right decision, but because he could avoid hard ones. He believed avoiding conflict was leadership. But in this field, avoiding conflict means letting go. And letting go means allowing vulnerable people to be harmed first. I never said it out loud, but I knew it clearly. Any place that hands power to feelings over skill is counting down its final days. That afternoon, when I walked past the activity room, a young employee gently pulled me aside. She whispered like the walls could listen. He is going to ruin everything. We need you." I looked at her for a few seconds. In her eyes was the fear I had seen too many times before, the fear that appears when a stable system begins to lose its anchor. I smiled lightly, not because I felt joy, but because I already knew. Every storm begins with a small gust of wind, and the wind started the moment the CEO demanded I apologize to someone I had never wronged. I just had not decided which direction I was going to move with that storm. I left the center at the end of the day, feeling like I no longer belonged there. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot in a tired golden stripe, and a soft gust of wind sent dry leaves spinning around my feet. I got into my car, placed the notebook on the passenger seat, and started the engine without turning on the radio like I usually did. I needed silence. There are days when silence is the only thing that lets you hear your own voice. When I got home, I did not turn on the lights right away. My apartment sat on the third floor of an old building, but it was clean and peaceful. I took off my shoes, hung my coat on the rack, and walked straight to the small workspace at the end of the hallway. That room held an oak file cabinet I had bought from a secondhand shop for a surprisingly low price. I still remember the seller telling me it was more than 20 years old, which only made me like it more. Old things tend to keep more truth than polished ones. I stood in front of the cabinet for a moment, my fingers brushing over its worn surface. I knew exactly what I was looking for. The funny thing was that I had known it ever since the meeting ended. Some things you do not touch for years, but when the time comes, they almost call your name. I opened the second drawer. The scent of old paper rose up, not unpleasant, just familiar, like meeting an old friend again. I pulled out a thin gray box. The 2007 consulting contract. I had signed it before becoming a full-time employee at Horizon Trails. I was 30 then, full of ambition, full of caution, and full of belief that people would always respect what you do if you do it well enough. That belief was not wrong, it just was not always enough. I opened the contract. The pages were wrapped in protective covers, the print still sharp. I lifted it and reread the section I had marked with red ink years ago. I whispered to myself, almost like a reminder. I am the one who always reads the contract, unlike them. Clause 11A. The clause I insisted on for one simple reason. I did not trust any system to be maintained correctly over many years unless the one who built it had the right to protect it. The clause stated that all operational procedures, internal checklists, risk assessment documents, and scheduling systems I designed during my consulting period were my personal intellectual property. The center was allowed to use them, but they had to renew the license every 3 years. If they did not, all access and usage rights would be revoked automatically. I flipped through a few more pages. The center's old logo, my signature, and the former director's signature, and a small note I had pinned beside the clause years ago. A simple reminder. Tell them again if they forget to renew. Just caution. Back then, I thought they would forget because they were busy, not because they were complacent. I opened my laptop and accessed the contract management system. I checked the license renewal status. The words appeared clear and sharp as a blade. License expired in March 2021. No renewal, no email, no request, which meant that for the past 2 years, the center had been using all my processes, documents, and scheduling systems without a valid agreement. In other words, I had full authority to revoke them at any moment. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, but because an obvious truth had just become undeniable. I was not trapped at Horizon Trails. I had never been. They were the ones dependent on me. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Mrs. June. I hesitated for a second and answered. Her voice was weak but warm. Honey, are you doing all right today? I looked down at the open contract. There are small moments in life that last only a few seconds, but are enough to pull you out of everything unreasonable around you. This was one of those moments. I said, Yes, I am all right. I am just finding my voice again. Mrs. June laughed softly, the sound thin but round, like two glasses gently touching. Good. You are doing well. Do not let anyone quiet you. When she hung up, I set the phone down. I looked again at the contract and understood something clearly. I was not trying to speak louder. I was trying to speak accurately. In my field, silence is sometimes the only choice that forces others to listen. I placed the contract back into its plastic cover, slipped it into the box, and set it neatly inside the drawer. But this time I did not close it. I left it slightly open, as if I knew I would return to it soon, because I knew Clause 11A had just awakened from a 20-year sleep. And once a legal clause wakes up, it never returns to its old state. I stood up, turned off the light, and stepped out of the workspace. The sky outside the window had darkened more than when I came home. I knew it was not the sign of rain. It was the sign of a shift I had waited long enough for, and I also knew that in this battle, I did not need to speak much. The right silence cut sharper than any explanation. All I had to do was wait. I had laid the foundation for 17 years. Now it was time for the structure they built on top of it to collapse under its own weight. The next morning, I arrived at the center earlier than usual. The air was still thin with dawn mist, and the hallway lights cast that familiar old yellow glow onto the tiles. No one knew today would be different. No one expected disruption. But I knew. This would be the day I quietly and precisely reclaimed what belonged to me. I unlocked my office, powered on the computer, and waited for the system to load. I was not in a hurry. The most lasting changes always begin with small movements that few people hear. I logged into the operations platform. The core access credentials were still under my name, tied to the clause they had forgotten. When the license expired, everything became my key alone. All I had to do was turn it. I started with the staffing schedule. It was the backbone of the center. I opened the permissions panel and unchecked the box next to Horizon Trails. A cold line appeared on the screen. Access has been revoked. No alarm, no warning sound, just a clean action, like brushing dust off the corner of a desk. I moved on to the safety checklists. That system was built from months of research, reviewing every small error in every wing. I remembered those nights rewriting each line, making sure every checkbox had a purpose. I revoked access for 3 departments. They would not notice yet, but in a few days, they would start feeling lost. I kept the preview visible so they could still orient themselves. I was not punishing anyone. I was simply withdrawing the responsibility they insisted they no longer needed. Next was the documentation control system. I had designed it end to end to ensure every report met federal standards. I removed edit permissions, keeping read access so the team would not panic. I did not want chaos. I wanted the truth to show itself. Without a foundation, those walls would start to crack. I continued with the medication management software. I did not touch patient files or medical data. I would never harm anyone to prove a point. I only disabled the code modules I had written as a consultant, the ones the center had quietly treated as their property. Again, a small action. Again, silence. Last was the internal reporting system. The dashboard Zach always bragged about was actually built on the core framework I created 7 years ago. Zach had only changed the colors and titles. Everything else was mine. When I revoked access, the dashboard went blank immediately. I watched the screen fade, then closed it. No particular emotion. It felt like shutting an old notebook. The door opened quietly. Marcus, the youngest IT staff member, stepped in with hesitation. "Are you sure you want to remove your permissions?" he asked, voice small but genuinely concerned. I turned to him and spoke slowly, clearly enough for him to know there was nothing left for me to explain. "If they do not need me, they do not need my systems." Marcus stood still for a few seconds, then nodded. "Some people do not need the whole story. Half a sentence is enough to understand the context." About an hour later, I heard Zach's footsteps in the hallway. He walked in with confusion written all over his face. "My dashboard is not loading," he said, as if announcing a catastrophe. His assistant stepped forward, glanced at the blank screen, and said, calm as ever, "Because Evelyn built it back when you were not even in college." I said nothing. I let the silence between us finish the conversation on my behalf. Zach started to react, but that single statement shut him down so quickly that even he seemed surprised. Some truths do not need debate. They stand on their own legs. Near mid-morning, I passed by the common room. I was not planning to stop, but the sound of Ava's sobs made me pause. I stood outside, unseen. Ava was telling a group of staff that I was sabotaging her, that I made her feel threatened. that I did not want Zach to grow. Her accusations came out between shaky breaths mixed with the dramatic gasps she produced every time she felt upset over something unclear. I did not step in. I did not defend myself. I knew that conversation was not for me. It was for the people who believed feelings outweighed logic. I watched through the gap in the door for a few seconds, then walked away. Some battles are won not by speaking, but by refusing to participate. When I returned to my office, the system notification was waiting. All access tied to my intellectual property had been revoked. No alerts, no flashing messages, just a few quiet lines disappearing from the screen, like footsteps fading as someone backs out of a room. I sat down and drew a slow breath. Every action I had taken that morning was small, precise, and gentle. I had not broken anything. I had simply removed the pillars I had placed there for 17 years. When the foundation shifts, the rest will find its own way down. And this was only the beginning. I spent that entire afternoon writing my resignation letter, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted every word to sit exactly where it belonged. I did not write much. I did not explain. Explaining to someone who does not wish to understand is a waste of ink and time. I wrote one opening line, short, polite, emotionless. I resign, effective immediately. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it on the CEO's desk at the end of the day. He looked at me, raising his eyebrows as if watching a poorly executed joke. Evelyn, we both know all you have to do is apologize to Ava, and this will be over. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed every grown woman would bow to the fragile emotions of a 25-year-old holding a phone to livestream. I answered with the same two words, light and flat as still water. I understand. The difference was that this time he did not understand, and I understood too well. I turned and walked out of his office, closing the door behind me, the way someone closes a book they have already finished. There was nothing left to hold on to. The next morning, Horizon Trails woke to a kind of quiet that anyone perceptive would immediately know was not ordinary. It was the quiet of a house that had lost its key holder. I was not there, but according to messages from a trusted staff member, everything began 15 minutes after shift change. The staffing schedule was completely empty. Not partially empty, not a display glitch. Empty. A blank screen, white as untouched paper. Staff stared at each other, refreshing the page, logging out and back in, switching workstations, but every action dragged them back to the same starting point. A few young nurses panicked, unsure which shift they belonged to. The older ones were calling around frantically, unsure which room needed them first. The compliance reports were locked. The department tried to open the inspection files for an upcoming audit, but instead of access, they received a message stating the documents were unavailable, requesting license verification. One staff member texted me saying the director of compliance looked like someone who had just discovered their house deed was missing. Medication systems in Wings C and D had lost advance permissions. This did not endanger patients since physicians still had access to primary charts. But all secondary functions, including inventory reconciliation, interaction alerts, and dosing discrepancy reports, were gone. No one understood why, and no one was calm enough to think deeper. The Incident Report Archive, the most crucial system for maintaining their quality rating, could not be accessed. The screen displayed an error, both simple and chilling. Document does not exist or is not authorized for use. Some assumed a server issue, others called IT. But when IT checked, they said only three words, not a malfunction. Departments began calling each other in confusion. One employee told me the morning hallway looked like a beehive that had just been hit. People running back and forth. People clutching walkies and calling out for support. Others standing in front of their monitors, sighing and waving their hands, like they wanted to delete the day altogether. Amid the chaos, an older physician I respected deeply walked into the break room. He looked at the blank screen, at the frantic nurses, and let out a long sigh. He said a line I later heard retold many times, each time making me laugh quietly. I guess the system retired before the residents did. A soft joke, polite, but sharp enough to show that everyone understood exactly who kept the system running. And that person was no longer there. By 9 o'clock, the legal department finally sensed something was off. They reviewed all access logs, contracts, and licenses. It did not take long. Clause 11 lit up like a warning beacon. A young lawyer ran straight into the CEO's office, his face paler than the sheet of paper he was holding. Sir, we are using intellectual property without a valid license. The sentence dropped into the quiet room like a stone into still water. The CEO braced himself on the desk, stunned. Then he shook his head, attempted a laugh. Impossible. Evelyn would never. But the unfinished sentence collapsed before it reached the end. The lawyer set the contract down and pointed at the line the CEO had ignored for 2 years. License expired in 2021. No renewal, no updated agreement, no notification. And worst of all, no one had checked. The CEO stared at the contract, then at the lawyer, then toward the door as if hoping someone would walk in and claim this was all a joke. But no one came. The hallway outside was filled only with the noise of chaos. I could picture him wiping sweat from his forehead. He had always believed silence was the safest management philosophy. But silence is only safe when you understand what you are neglecting. And he had neglected everything. I received another message from a staff member. Boss, the CEO is sweating like the federal inspectors just knocked on the door. I read it and smiled quietly, not out of spite. That feeling is not familiar to me, but because everything was unfolding exactly the way logic dictated. You cannot treat a foundation like it is decorative wallpaper. When the foundation pulls away, the whole structure shakes, and this was only their first day feeling it. The chaotic morning was only the beginning. By noon, Horizon Trails had slipped into what many later called the darkest day in the center's history. I heard the story through messages from former colleagues, each update like a shard from a broken mirror. Every piece reflected the truth leadership had avoided for years. No one ran this place except the people who knew what they were doing. The first resignation arrived at 8:30. A young nurse named Amanda placed her letter on her supervisor's desk without crying and without saying more than 5 words. If Evelyn goes, no one keeps this place safe. Then she took off her badge and walked out. By 9 o'clock, the second, third, and fourth resignations appeared. No one coordinated. No one led a movement. They simply looked at one another and understood that once the anchor was gone, everything else tilted. One seasoned nurse spoke in a small meeting room, her voice as calm as if she were reading medication orders. I would rather leave with someone who has ethics than stay with someone who has a title. The room fell silent, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. So true that no one could argue with it. By 10:30, the count had reached 12. Some walked out immediately. Some requested 30 days of leave, though everyone understood they would not return. Their trust in the center was gone, not because of technical changes, because of moral ones. Zach had been assigned to find temporary staff. He darted through the halls like a lost squirrel, sweating, while trying to hold on to that trademark confident smile. He called one staffing agency, then another, then 5. Every agency refused. Some politely claimed they lacked personnel. Others said plainly they did not want to get involved with a center spiraling out of control. Zach held his phone the way someone holds a medical diagnosis. His assistant whispered something to him, but he simply shook his head. When I heard the story, I pictured it clearly and could not help a thin layer of irony. The same man who once called me outdated for not keeping up with technology now cannot hire a single temporary nurse. While Zach spun in circles, department heads met. They tried calculating how long operations could continue before the system collapsed for real. But before anyone could propose a solution, an email hit the center-wide inbox. Federal inspectors would arrive within 72 hours. A routine audit that anyone in the field knows is never routine. The last time they came, a facility 12 miles away was fined nearly $500,000 for missing 2 medication audits. A colleague sent me a message with only 4 words. Boss, they are done. I looked at the message, then set the phone down. Not because I felt joy. I do not know how to feel triumphant in a way that pushes someone off a cliff, but some lessons are only learned by people who insist on standing at the edge. Horizon Trails had chosen that edge long Go. By late afternoon, the number of resignations reached 23. 23 people with real skills, real experience, real integrity. People who had kept the center alive for years. People who had stood beside me through staff shortages, razor tight inspections, and moments where responsibility and error lived inches apart. They were not leaving because they hated the center. They left because the center had abandoned them first. I was making tea when my phone vibrated. An unlisted number. The screen displayed Horizon Trail's administrative office. I stared at the phone like I was looking at a returning ghost. In that moment, I knew who was calling. The CEO. I did not answer. The phone rang again, a second time, a third. Then a message appeared. Evelyn, please call me back. We need you to discuss some documents. I touched the screen, but did not open it. I read the line once and set the phone beside my cup of tea. There was nothing left to say. Not because I wanted distance, because it was too late for any conversation that meant anything. They only saw me when they started losing what I built. They thought I would come back with one call. They thought I would save them again. But saving someone only matters when they want to stand on solid ground rather than the shadow of their own decisions. I sat back down, poured my tea, and let the afternoon light stretch across the table in a thin, golden line. I took a sip and heard the phone vibrate again. I did not move. I let it ring until it stopped. Sometimes silence is not a weapon. It is simply a reminder that you no longer owe anyone an explanation. As night fell, I read the messages pouring in from former colleagues. They described the chaos inside the center, Zach shouting for the system to be restored, frantic emergency meetings with no answers, and the pale face of the CEO when a federal attorney asked for the latest compliance records. I read everything. But I did not reply. None of it belonged to me anymore. I had done my part, and I left at the right time. They never understood how important the foundation was until it disappeared, and now they had to learn how to stand without me. Not because I abandoned them, but because they told me, in more ways than one, that they no longer needed me. I simply did what they asked. And when 23 people walked out with me that day, I knew I was not the only one who understood. I did not know exactly what happened at Horizon Trails the next morning, but when my phone lit up nonstop with messages from former coworkers, I understood that things had gone far beyond the control of anyone still there. Someone sent me a blurry photo of the main conference room door with a sign I had never seen used in 17 years of working there. Emergency board meeting. Attendance is strictly by designation only. That meant something had exploded inside, and not something small. I set my phone on the table and made another cup of tea. People often imagine tense meetings as shouting, slamming desks, and chaos. But I had stood behind the doors of much larger meetings and learned a different truth. The deepest cuts always happen in silence. The sharpest questions are asked in calm voices. About an hour later, the first update arrived from someone in administration. You will not believe this. They are questioning the CEO for favoritism that compromised resident safety. I looked at the text and exhaled lightly. I believed it. I had seen that danger long ago. He just had not. A second message arrived right after. They are demanding he explain why the center lost 23 employees in less than 24 hours. Why is the operating system locked? Why compliance records vanished from department access? And why the license expired 2 years ago without renewal? They said the CEO stood there, pale as the wall behind him. In all my years there, I had never seen him truly afraid. But now it seemed that day had come. 15 minutes later, another message appeared, this time from someone in human resources sitting right outside the meeting room. Zach has been stripped of his title. I read it twice. Not surprised, but feeling a quiet sense of closure. People who rise without merit fall without tragedy. It is simply the natural arc. Another message followed. Ava has been banned from the center. I set my phone down and smiled softly. Not a triumphant smile, but the kind you give when a long, cracked window finally gets replaced. Staff told me Ava tried to enter the common room to clarify her intentions, but security stopped her under the board's order. I could picture her face without needing more details. By noon, the board was still in session. That alone showed how serious it was. An emergency meeting lasting more than 3 hours is not about finding solutions. It is about finding fault. And when leadership realizes the fault lies in misjudging people, the consequences fall into place on their own. I spent the rest of the morning tidying my home office, not to make big changes, just organizing old folders, rearranging books, wiping a thin layer of dust from the shelves. Simple tasks that kept my mind away from the chaos outside. I had left. Whatever remained was no longer mine to handle. In the early afternoon, the first email from Horizon Trails arrived in my inbox. The subject was simple: invitation to collaborate. I read it slowly, word by word. They said the board had reviewed all records, assessed recent incidents, evaluated the remaining team, and concluded that they needed me to return as an independent consultant. The proposed salary was triple what I once earned, flexible contract terms, full authority over safety operations, and a written guarantee that leadership would not interfere with my professional decisions. A carefully written, respectful, earnest invitation. I read it 3 times, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to be sure I understood every word. Then I leaned back in my chair. Afternoon light drifted gently across the room. I looked at the email the way someone looks at a door that should have opened years earlier. They said they wanted me back. What they did not understand was that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired with money. I placed my hands on the keyboard. I did not think long. I did not write a speech. I wrote only what felt true. I do not return to what breaks itself. I reread the line once. It was not sharp like rejection. It was simply the truth. And truth never needs to raise its voice. I hit send, shut down my computer, and stood up. There was no sense of victory, no sense of revenge. What I felt was closer to the end of a long shift, tired but clear. What I built had been cracked by their own hands. I was not the one who broke it. I was not the one meant to mend it. No one is obligated to heal a place that does not wish to be healed. As the evening settled, one last message came from a former coworker. They said that after reading my reply, the board stayed silent for a very long time. Someone sighed. Another said the center might have lost the only person who understood how to keep it standing. I sat by the window, watching golden leaves drift slowly to the ground in the late afternoon wind. I thought about my 17 years and felt no regret. I did not leave because I lost. I left because I had finished my part. The truth was simple, impossible to argue with. When a place destroys itself, you have no reason to return. After sending the email declining Horizon Trail's offer, I felt a small, hollow space in my chest, but not the kind that comes from loss. It felt more like stepping out of a dark room and realizing your eyes need a moment to adjust to the light. A slow relief, but a steady one. I realized I no longer had to hold together a place already breaking apart. I could build a new one, where every crack would be acknowledged from the start. My home office was small, but quiet enough for me to hear my own thoughts clearly. I looked at the stack of documents I had collected over the years, the guides, the lessons learned from tense inspections, the notes I wrote about treating elderly residents kindly on their weakest days. I placed my hand on the folder and knew it was time for these things to be used for their real purpose. I opened my laptop. The first draft carried a simple title: Ethics for Senior Care Professionals. Not a slogan, not a declaration, just the name of something that had been forgotten too long in this industry: a moral foundation. I wrote for 3 straight hours. When I finally looked up, the sun was high. That morning marked the first day of the training center I was about to build. A week later, the training center officially opened. Small, modest, but with a spine. In a borrowed room inside a community building, there were only 3 old wooden tables, one whiteboard, and a warm cup of tea always waiting. No banners, no shiny logo, just a place where people who wanted to do the right thing could sit together. I emailed invitations to the 23 people who had left Horizon Trails with me. I thought they might hesitate or need time after the chaos. But 6 hours later, every single one replied. No one asked about salary. No one asked about titles. Most wrote just 3 words: when do we start? On the day they arrived, I stood by the door waiting. When I saw each person walk in, some carrying old folders, some with coffee cups, some still wearing the name badges they had taken off the day they left the center, I realized something clear. They did not come for me. They came because they believed this field could be better. The first training session felt strange in the best way. Quiet, warm, steady. I let everyone share the moment they chose to leave. An older nurse said, "I left because I refused to watch residents treated like numbers." Another said, "I left because I want my kid to be proud when they hear what I do for a living." When it was my turn, I said only one sentence. I left because I had watched the right thing done the wrong way for too long. We began building the curriculum. One person handled documentation, another taught risk assessment, another shared communication technique for residents with dementia. Each person brought a piece of moral clarity that the old center had lost. Within 2 weeks, the class was full. Staff from other care centers showed up, some driving 2 hours just to sit in that small room for once. Morning. They said they came because they heard what happened at Horizon Trails and wanted to understand what made 23 people leave at once. I simply answered, "Sometimes the right thing you do is not staying in the wrong place." Then one afternoon, as I was revising a lesson plan, my phone rang. The voice on the other end made me sit up straight. "Evelyn, it's me, June's daughter." The next sentence made my eyes sting with a warmth I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. "My mother wants to move to the place you are working now. She said she is not afraid of forgetting her medication schedule there." A week later, I picked up Mrs. June with the training center's small transport car. She sat in the back seat, her face brightening when she saw me open the door. "Honey, is it time for my medicine yet?" she said, exactly the way she had asked me years ago. I answered, "Yes, ma'am, you are all set." But this time the words held a different meaning. Here, no one lets her forget anything important. On the day she moved in, I checked her new room. Everything was arranged carefully. Pale green curtains she liked, her old armchair, and the medication reminder clock I hung myself. I stood there for a long moment, realizing that peace can be built from very small things. A few days later, we received a stack of letters from families whose loved ones had been at Horizon Trails. They thanked me for speaking up by walking away. One letter made me pause longer than the rest. "Thank you for not staying silent when silence could have cost us someone we loved." I folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer. Some gratitude must be kept in the right place so you never forget why you refused to compromise. During one class, while I was teaching scheduling ethics, a trainee joked, "I guess this place is already 40% safer than Horizon Trails on day one." I raised an eyebrow. "Because there is no Zach here." The room burst into laughter, a soft laugh, not bitter, not sharp, just a breeze that softened the whole space. When class ended, I stood outside watching the late afternoon light stretch across the wooden tables. 23 people walked past me, waving, saying, "See you tomorrow." They did not look like people escaping a broken place. They looked like people moving towards something better. In that moment, I realized I had lost nothing. I had simply stepped away from a foundation that had rotted to build one stronger, cleaner, and ethical enough to stand without needing a miracle. And this time, the foundation was built by people who understood the value of kindness. People who chose to walk with me. People who chose to stand tall. People who believe that sometimes hope is not the thing that comes last. Hope is the thing you build yourself. 3 weeks after the training center found its rhythm, I settled into my new life. Mornings spent teaching, afternoons reviewing material, evenings visiting Mrs. June if she seemed a little confused. Everything flowed so smoothly that sometimes I could not believe this was the life of someone who had walked away from a place that once drained me to the bone. One afternoon, as I was organizing lesson plans, my inbox lit up. The sender was Horizon Trails board office. Just one short line, but enough to stop my hands. "The federal inspection this morning has failed." I opened the email. My eyes moved slowly through each item. Incorrect medication permissions, insufficient staffing on shift schedules, incident reports are inaccessible, safety logs out of sync. All the weaknesses I had once warned about, once repaired, once patched with my own hands through countless shifts. I closed my laptop, no satisfaction, no triumph. Only a soft stillness settles in my chest. Horizon Trails did not collapse because I left. It collapsed because of everything they once dismissed. The writer added one line, We thought you would want to know. No request to return, no offer. Just a message sent to the person who had kept that place steady for so many years. I walked to the wooden cabinet and took out the envelope containing the 2007 contract. For years, it had been the only thing protecting me from leadership's reckless decisions. Today, it no longer carries that duty. I placed the envelope in the metal tray by the window. The flame began at the paper's edge, spreading slowly, turning familiar lines into curling black strands. No pain, no regret, just a final period at the end of a long chapter. The second page burned, then the third. I watched closely, as if witnessing an older version of myself being folded away into the past. When the last page arched and crumbled into ash, I spoke softly. They thought I was weak because I stayed silent. But silence is just a breath before someone brings down their own house. Not a threat, not a victory, simply a lesson I had learned too well. That night, I carried the tray of ashes to the porch. A light breeze rose, enough to lift the thin flakes into the dark. The old chapter closed without a single dramatic sound. The next morning, I returned to the training center. The 23 people who had left with me now stood as instructors, preparing materials for the next class. They laughed, talked, and carried themselves far lighter than they ever had during their final days at Horizon Trails. In that moment, I understood something simple. Sometimes the rebirth of a place has nothing to do with a building. It begins with the people who choose to rise together. The afternoon session ended early. I walked down the small hallway where the last light of day spilled across the floor in soft gold patches. I stopped at the whiteboard where we had written the most important sentence of the very first lesson. Care workers do not only keep people alive, they keep their dignity intact. I touched the words lightly, feeling them etched deeper into our own journey than into the board itself. Outside, I watched the students leaving. Some waved, some promised to see me tomorrow. I watched them walk away in the evening glow and understood once more that I had lost nothing when I left Horizon Trails. I had simply left a place that no longer wished to be healed, to build one that deserved to endure. Dusk settled by the time I reached the parking lot. I unlocked my phone. Messages filled the screen from people who watch my storytelling channel. Some said they missed their mothers listening to last week's story. Some said they were waiting for the next chapter. Some simply said thank you for not staying silent. I leaned against my car and turned on the voice recorder. My voice was low and steady, like the sunset falling behind me. If you have followed me to this moment, thank you. A story is only complete when someone listens. And if you want to hear more stories about quiet justice, sharp as a scalpel, remember to subscribe. It helps more than you think. I turned off the recorder, opened my car door, and sat inside. A long day ended in just enough silence. No noise, no bitterness. Just an ending arriving exactly on time. A decisive quiet. The final lesson I gave myself.